Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Audio check for the stenographer. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Audio check for the reporter. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Yep. The Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management will come to order. The chair now asks unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing without objection. So ordered. The chair also asks unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection. So ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. The chair now recognizes himself for the purposes of an opening statement for 5 minutes. Chair thanks our witnesses for being here today to discuss the effectiveness of building codes and the federal government's role in encouraging their use. Currently, FEMA provides direct funding for building code adoption and enforcement through the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, heretofore known as BRIC. After a major disaster, FEMA encourages the adoption and enforcement of consensus-based building codes through the Public Assistance Program. FEMA also considers the extent to which a community has complied with the building code standards set out in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018 when making decisions about grant awards. In short, FEMA spends a lot of taxpayer resources on coercing building code adoption and compliance. This includes releasing the first ever building code strategy in 2022 with the objective of, quote, amplifying climate science messaging to increase public demand for building codes and standards, end quote. I am deeply concerned that under this current administration, FEMA continues to attempt to impose these types of ideology-based agendas. I believe that building codes should be the purview of state and local governments, which will help ensure that building code enforcement remains economically feasible for communities. However, recognizing that since Congress has directed FEMA to support building codes as one aspect of pre-disaster mitigation, we should at least make sure that these requirements are practical, cost-effective, and actually make our communities safer and more affordable. As it stands, I'm concerned that federal overreach regarding building codes is imposing unnecessary burdens on business and property owners. It certainly appears that FEMA is using a one-size-fits-all approach that fails to take into account where different sets of codes that reflect industry standards or geography or respond to local hazards might be better suited to the needs of a community. I'm hoping that our witnesses here today will shed light on the success and challenges of FEMA's building code policies, particularly as compared to their experience working with other federal agencies that require code adoption. I have not seen sufficient data to convince me that requiring the adoption of the latest editions of building codes saves taxpayer dollars or makes anything more affordable in an unaffordable housing market. Are the changes between additions significant enough to significantly lower disaster costs and protect life and property? My understanding is that many of the changes between code additions has nothing to do with disaster resiliency, but instead are related to things like energy efficiency. Additionally, FEMA is expanding taxpayer dollars and human resources on promoting building codes and standards at the expense of other mitigation measures. The agency is steadily increasing the number of pre-disaster mitigation awards funded for building code adoption and enforcement. According to the CRS, in the first year of BRIC, 8 such grants were awarded. By last year, it was 93. Now, if we're seeing more than a 1,000% increase in the number of mitigation grants being directed toward building codes, is the agency truly meeting the congressional intent of the DRRA? So what I'd like to know is, what is your experience, or what your experience has been like from the other side? In your view, has FEMA's enforcement of building codes made communities safer and more affordable, or has it diverted limited disaster dollars away from high-impact projects? Has FEMA provided applicants and sub-applicants with an appropriate spectrum of building codes to choose from that can ensure flexibility, or are they being overly rigid and prescriptive? Is the emphasis on building code adoption limiting pre-disaster mitigation dollars from going to the 65% of communities in this country that have not yet adopted the latest editions of the building codes? Federal regulations often pose unnecessary burdens and unaffordable mandates on state and local governments, as well as everyday American. My hope is that if our tax dollars are being used to support building codes, then we are seeing a significant return on our investment in the form of safety and affordability. With that, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on this issue. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Titus for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today to discuss FEMA's implementation of building codes across all its programs in order to help communities prepare for and recover from disasters. Even before FEMA's creation, building codes have played a role in disaster assistance and recovery, beginning with the 1974 Disaster Relief Act. This act gave the President authority to provide funding to state and local governments to help repair or reconstruct buildings damaged by a major disaster, and this was to be in conformity with applicable codes and standards. Following the creation of FEMA then in 1979 and the signing of the Stafford Act in 1988, this practice continued for disaster response. The signing of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, DRRA, in 2018 marked an even greater emphasis on building codes when it comes to hazard mitigation. In this regard, the DRRA directed FEMA to create the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, which you heard from the chairman is now known as BRIC, and to consider 11 different criteria when awarding pre-disaster mitigation funds, including the extent to which applicants have adopted and enforced the latest building codes. The incentives and funding provided by the DRRA are critical since 35 states have not adopted modern building codes. This creates a public safety hazard and unnecessarily increases the cost of disaster recovery. Additionally, the National Institute of Building Sciences found that designing new buildings that exceed the 2015 International Residential Code and the International Building Code would result in 87,000 new long-term jobs. Since the DRRA was enacted, FEMA has adopted a wide range of building code requirements across its disaster response programs. Codes from two of the organizations represented here today, the ICC and IAPMO, are referenced as in the current programs, which is particularly helpful for Nevada because we use IAPMO's plumbing and mechanical codes, which form the basis of our state's regulations. I'd also be remiss if I didn't recognize the role that Nevada plumbing, heating, and cooling industry has played during the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure the efficient use of our water supply and to protect the safety of our hospitality workers. While FEMA's recently recognized a more diverse set of codes, including those predominantly used in Nevada for disaster response, it's my understanding that more could be done to update education and guidance documents for resilience programs, which are essential to helping communities avoid physical and economic losses from future disasters. So as we convene this hearing today, I'm interested in learning more from our panel on the limitations that may be placed on states and localities when a more diverse set of codes is not recognized and how this impact may result in the disaster mitigation costs and local workforces. I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for FEMA to approve any particular building code, but rather for there to be greater consideration of all building codes that have a basis in research, expert scrutiny, and application to state and local needs. So again, I thank our witnesses for joining us, and I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Subcommittee Chair Perry and Subcommittee Ranking Member Titus for calling today's hearing on the effectiveness of building codes and mitigating against disasters. Before we delve into the topic of building codes, I do want to recognize FEMA's current funding crisis. For the second year in a row, FEMA is currently operating in immediate needs funding. For a month, FEMA has been forced to pause all funding for recovery and mitigation projects. There are currently over 2,687 projects on hold. 5 of those are in my district. This hold slows recovery and hurts communities in their time of need. It's especially dangerous that Congress has allowed this to happen at the height of disaster season. Last fall, the administration submitted a $9 billion disaster supplemental to Congress. I am pleased that the continuing resolution the House will vote on later today includes some money for the Disaster Relief Fund. However, I'm disappointed it does not include any of the funding included in the President's disaster supplemental request. Without that funding, communities throughout the country will still be denied resources they desperately need, and FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund will likely run out of money before the start of the next fiscal year. So Congress should approve the President's request for supplemental disaster assistance funding before the end of this Congress. And today we're focused on reducing the impacts of disaster through mitigation. Since 1980, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety reports the U.S. has sustained over $2.7 trillion in losses due to natural disasters. As these disasters grow in intensity and frequency, the adoption and enforcement of hazard-resistant building codes is essential to prevent future funding shortfalls at FEMA. There's a connection here. Investment in hazard-resistant codes is a scientifically proven way to save money and to protect communities. According to FEMA, the adoption and implementation of resilient codes is the most effective mitigation measure a community can take. FEMA has reported that a nationwide adoption of modern codes would result in $600 billion of savings from disaster impact by 2060. And the National Institute of Building Sciences found that hazard-resistant codes saved the taxpayer $11 for every $1 invested. The implementation of stronger codes helps local governments and homeowners alike, since they reduce insurance premiums and post-disaster financial exposure. A recent study by CoreLogic and the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety also found that modern codes reduce the likelihood of mortgage default following extreme weather by about 50%. Unfortunately, FEMA reports that 65% of counties, cities, and towns across the U.S. have not adopted modern building codes. If we want to support mitigation efforts that offer the greatest greatest return on investment, it is common sense to provide communities with the resources they need to adopt the latest codes. Funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law for FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation programs, including BRIC and the Safeguarding Tomorrow Loan Fund, is making it possible for communities without hazard-resistant codes to catch up. Last year, FEMA allocated an additional $2 million for each state and territory and up to $25 million for tribal governments for building code improvements. This funding reflected policy that bipartisan members of this committee have long advocated. I hope the agency will again include building code funding in the upcoming BRIC Notice of Funding Opportunity. Thank you all of you for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. The chair would now like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Briefly, the chair will take a moment to explain our lighting system to our witnesses. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means you're running out of time or it's coming to an end, and red means please conclude your remarks. The chair asks unanimous consent that the witness's full statement be included in the record without objection, so ordered. The chair asks unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing without objection, so ordered. The chair also asks unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes, and at this time, the chair now recognizes Ranking Member Titus for introductions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my pleasure to welcome the panel and to introduce 2 of its members. I'm pleased first to introduce Cindy Davis, who's testifying on behalf of the International Code Council. Ms. Davis recently retired following a dozen years with the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development, 9 of them as the Deputy Director of the department, following a 3-year stint as Director of Virginia's Building Code Office. Before moving to Virginia in 2012, her career in the building and fire code profession began in 1988 in Western Pennsylvania. She has served on the boards of the congressionally chartered National Institute of Building Sciences, the Building Officials and Code Administrators International during the merger of 3 model code organizations that became the Code Council. It's a mouthful, and as president of the Code Council's board in 2022. Last month, Governor Youngkin appointed her to the Virginia Board of Housing and Community Development. I want to thank her for being here, and she certainly brings a wealth of experience and knowledge. Thank you, Ms. Davis. Now, it's a special pleasure for me to introduce our next witness, who comes from my district in Nevada, Mr. Jordan Cranebuell, who serves as the Executive Director of the Plumbing, Heating, Cooling Contractors of Nevada, based in Henderson. A licensed journeyman plumber and master plumber in the state of Nevada, Jordan was raised working in his father's plumbing and heating company and has been involved in local and national code development since 1991. He certainly knows this industry from the ground up and maybe below ground. Between 1988 and 2018, he worked for the Clark County Building Department, starting as a plumbing and mechanical inspector, and went on to lead the Plumbing and Mechanical Code Official Office for about 27 of his 30 years with the department. As a lifetime member of the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials, Jordan has served on multiple code committees for the association and has been extensively involved in its leadership, having served on their board of directors for 2 terms between 2000 and 2006. Now, many of you may not know that the IAPMO codes serve as the basis for Nevada's regulations when it comes to plumbing and mechanical codes, and they've played a significant role in managing the efficient use of our water supply, which, as I mentioned earlier, has protected our hospitality industry, especially during the COVID pandemic. Jordan's experience and extensive knowledge of code development, adoption, and implementation will certainly benefit our subcommittee greatly today, and I want to thank him also for being here.
Chair, thanks. The gentlelady from Nevada, the ranking member. And with that, we're going to start over here and go that way. Mr. Strickland, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus, and distinguished members of the committee for allowing me to testify today. I'm proud to testify today representing the state emergency management directors of all 50 states, territories, and the District of Columbia. I'll get to the topic at hand in a minute, but would be remiss if I did not first address the markup that occurred just before we began here. NEMA could not be more pleased with the committee reporting of H.R. 7671, the Disaster Management Cost Modernization Act. This bill will make it easier to manage and track disaster grants, including easing oversight of waste, fraud, and abuse. It will incentivize the rapid closeout of disasters, thereby reducing the need for a large FEMA footprint and ultimately driving down the cost of disasters, and to the topic at hand today. Give states and localities the flexibility needed to enhance the adoption and enforcement of building codes, critical steps to ensure resilience. And we realize that resilience cannot just be a buzzword used to identify a long-term goal. It must be actionable and tangible to be effective. NEMA remains focused on identifying and promoting methods to ensure that resilience is incorporated into all stages of emergency management. This includes updating preparedness and mitigation plans, incorporating resilience principles into exercises, and rebuilding stronger post-disaster. By making resilience a cornerstone of that we do as emergency managers, we can drive improvements that make our communities safer and better able to adapt to changing threats. As disasters become more frequent and larger in scale, scope, and complexity, we know we will never be able to respond our way out of the vulnerabilities our communities face. Instead, we must invest in strong mitigation projects and building resilience. One of the ways we do this is through initiatives relating to building codes. 2 examples come to mind when thinking about the impact of code initiatives. In 2018, Alaska suffered a 7.0 earthquake that was very geographically similar to the famed 1964 earthquake, which killed more than 100 people. In 2018, however, with the adoption of model building codes, there were no reported deaths or serious injuries. In Pennsylvania, grant-elevated homes were not impacted by floodwaters along the Schuylkill River in West Northam Township, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, during Tropical Storm Ida. These homes have been retrofitted to a new code and to best available data heights through a FEMA grant, experienced no damages on the first floor and below, and thus saving a significant amount in rebuilding. Despite these success stories, code initiatives cannot be one-size-fits-all across our diverse nation. For states, a challenge lies in comparing building code requirements, metrics, and implementation on a national scale. At the local level, smaller or under-resourced jurisdictions may lack the expertise, funding, or staff to develop and enforce strong building codes, leading to inconsistent protection across the state and negatively impacting scoring for programs like BRIC. More generally speaking, we as a nation will never have the capacity at the state, local, and federal levels to achieve all that is desired in the business of consequence management. We can take small, integral steps, however, that can have widespread impacts. Investing in mitigation and resilience makes real differences in the lives of those affected by disasters and allows us to build back smarter to lessen the impacts of future events. While every community's approach to mitigation and resilience will differ based on vulnerability and risk environments, priorities, and areas of vulnerability, the cumulative effect will be a stronger nation, better postured to adapt to the threats of the future. And one note in closing with this, the comments from Congressman Larson, we concur with 100%. Moving forward with the DRF, it must be funded and funded appropriately for all of us to survive. As a nation, we must find a way to be more deliberate in how we manage the DRF. I thank you.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Hughes for your 5 minutes opening statement.
Thank you. That better? Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus, and esteemed members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the National Association of Home Builders. The recent increase in natural disasters has underscored the important role home builders serve in constructing safe and resilient homes. NHB represents over 140,000 members who construct approximately 80% of the new housing built in the U.S. each year. We are committed to collaborating with all levels of government to develop cost-effective solutions that enhance home and community resilience while preserving housing choice and affordability. While NHB acknowledges the important role building codes play in enhancing resiliency, we are concerned about FEMA's disproportionate focus on the adoption of the very latest codes. Building codes do little to improve flood control, manage stormwater, or address the existing building stock. They also fail to strengthen essential infrastructure like power supply and roadways. Creating true resiliency requires a holistic approach that encompasses all community systems. FEMA's emphasis on building codes can divert attention and resources from improvements to infrastructure, emergency services, and existing buildings. A resilient building is of little value if the supporting infrastructure is lacking, and a resilient home offers little comfort if it remains unaffordable. Builders know firsthand that housing affordability is at the top of mind for homebuyers. Adopting the latest building codes can significantly impact affordability. For example, a study by Home Innovation Research Labs found that implementing the 2021 International Residential Code could add up to $5,700 to the cost of an average single-family home compared to the 2018 code. NHB estimates that 77% of U.S. households cannot afford a median-priced new home. Even a a $1,000 increase in price could push over 100,000 households out of the market. These challenges only deepen the struggle for families seeking affordable housing. The ability to customize building codes becomes crucial as it ensures not only resilience and relevance, but also cost effectiveness. NHB has been an active participant in the ICC's code development process since its inception, ensuring that our members, who are the primary users of these model codes, bring their extensive hands-on experience to the evaluation of proposed changes. However, it's crucial that state and local governments retain the flexibility to adopt codes that address their specific geographic and jurisdictional needs, even if those codes are not developed by ICC. If FEMA takes an overly prescriptive approach, we risk diverting our attention from enhancing community resilience to merely navigating the codes that qualify for FEMA funding. FEMA should allow jurisdictions to tailor codes to their unique risk to avoid imposing unnecessary requirements that can drive up costs for builders and homebuyers. The Promoting Resilient Buildings Act is vital legislation that seeks to permanently codify the definition of latest published editions of building codes, giving state and local governments the necessary time to adopt codes tailored to their specific needs and economic conditions. Without this legislation, FEMA could restrict certain funds to only the jurisdictions that have adopted the most recent codes, pressuring them into hasty changes that may not enhance safety or resilience. Thank you for this subcommittee. Thank you to the subcommittee for your unanimous support of this important legislation. And I'd like to thank you for your time and attention today. I look forward to working together to forge a path that balances safety, resilience, and affordability, ultimately benefiting all Americans. Thank you very much for your time.
Chair, thanks, Mr. Hughes. The chair now recognizes Mr. Cranebowl for your testimony for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Ranking Member Titus, for that introduction and for your leadership on construction codes and water-related issues. Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jordan Cranebowl. I have been serving as the Executive Director of the Plumbing, Heating, Cooling Contractors of Nevada since 2019. Prior to joining the association, I worked for Clark County Building Department for 30 years, where I was the lead plumbing mechanical code official. I'm also a member of IAPMO, an organization that develops model codes and standards used in our sector. The resiliency of America's buildings rely on a robust ecosystem of model codes and standards developed by standards development organizations. These organizations include, but are not limited to, IAPMO, ICC, NFPA, ASHRAE, and ASCE. The model codes and standards developed by these reputable organizations contain important hazard-resistant provisions. At times, these codes and standards compete with one another. Today's buildings are more resilient because of the competition, which results in improved safety, affordability, and resiliency. Jurisdictions benefit from being able to choose which of these model codes best meet their requirements. Federal policy should support this effort. FEMA's building code policies and guidance can be improved. The challenge in our industry has been that FEMA, in its building code initiative, seems to only be interested in promoting the products and services of one standards development organization. More than 100 organizations across 15 states have asked FEMA and Congress to address this issue. The industry appreciates the efforts made by members of the House, including this panel, who have urged FEMA to act on this issue. Thanks to these efforts, there has been some movement. However, it continues to be a challenge and has created several problems that I would like to highlight. Number one, it discourages competition and limits options for local skilled professionals. FEMA's policy states that it does not approve or endorse any products or companies. It is concerning that FEMA's communications relating to building codes do not seem to follow that policy. Examples of how FEMA has outright marketed the products of a single standards development organization have been provided for the record. As a federal agency, FEMA's role is not to weigh in on a competitive environment and to usurp the role of skilled professionals at a local level who select these codes. FEMA does not improve resiliency by telling jurisdictions which brand of model codes they should select. Number two, it introduces barriers in state and local code adoption. One of the major unintended consequences of FEMA's singular focus is that it has interfered with code adoptions. From New Jersey, Texas, and Missouri, we have seen examples where code adoptions have been delayed because of confusion over which specific national model code meets FEMA's requirements. To clarify, these are jurisdictions who are trying to do the right thing and update their construction codes. But they are being delayed because of the confusion created by FEMA's own marketing materials and the stakeholders promoting them. Number three, it threatens to negatively impact construction trades. My organization is one of the largest trainers of plumbing professionals in the state. In Nevada, because of FEMA's misaligned efforts, because of FEMA's misaligned efforts were to change its construction codes to another code, it would be very detrimental. The cost of recreating our training programs, certification programs to address the specific provisions of an entirely new construction code would be hard to recover from and threaten our existence without any benefit to resiliency. Finally, the benefits of construction codes come from their effective implementation and enforcement, not just adoption. FEMA's strategy on resilient buildings should address the very real workforce, training, and supply chain issues faced by communities across the United States. In conclusion, implementing hazard-resistant construction codes is important to improving the resiliency of communities in Nevada and nationwide. We appreciate the actions of this committee and that you have taken to date and continue to seek your assistance in helping ensure a level playing field for all major construction codes in FEMA's policies, programs, and upcoming strategic efforts. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
The chair thanks you, Mr. Cranbull, for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Ms. Davis for 5 minutes for your testimony, ma'am.
Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus, and members of the subcommittee, good morning and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Cindy Davis. I've worked to advance and implement building codes for more than 35 years and have served as the board president of the International Code Council. ICC is a nonprofit organization driven by its more than 60,000 members, dedicated to helping communities in the building industry provide safe and resilient construction through the development of model codes and standards, the I-codes, which are the most widely used codes in the United States. In the U.S., there is no national building code. Our codes are developed by standards development organizations which develop model codes at no cost to taxpayers. States and communities then choose whether to use these models to govern construction activities. This system aligns with the OMB directive, which tells federal agencies to use private sector standards instead of expending public resources developing redundant or government-unique ones. The I-codes are updated every 3 years through a vigorous open consensus process involving all stakeholders and interested parties, including valued participation from NAHB, PHCC, fire services, architects, engineers, emergency managers, and other industry and manufacturer representatives. They are the only model codes that expressly consider affordability in their development. Regular updates ensure the codes reflect the most recent developments in building science and technology, new construction materials and techniques, and lessons learned from building failures and disasters. From the start, ICC has prioritized hazard mitigation in code development. Studies have confirmed that the adoption and implementation of current model codes is one of the best mitigation strategies. The National Institute of Building Sciences estimates that building to recent editions of the I-code saves $11 for every $1 invested, and FEMA projects $600 billion in cumulative savings by 2060 if all future construction adhered to current I-codes. Also, research continues to find that these codes have no appreciable implications for housing affordability. No peer-reviewed research has found otherwise, and one analysis found that 30 years of code advancements only increased a home's purchase price by 0.5 percentage point. Up-to-date codes reduce homeowners' net flood insurance costs by at least 5%, While multiple studies have found that current I-code construction significantly reduced the likelihood of mortgage default following a disaster. For these reasons, FEMA has incentivized and encouraged the use of resilient codes to protect lives and property and to reduce the need for future federal disaster recovery funding. This approach has been consistently bipartisan. It was advanced through the Trump administration's National Mitigation Investment Strategy and continues today. These efforts have appropriately focused on codes and standards that are comprehensive and have demonstrated mitigation benefits. A blanket expansion of FEMA's code recognitions to thousands of codes developed in the U.S. is presenting a solution in search of a problem, and respectfully, FEMA should not be handing out participation trophies when it comes to building safety and community resilience. This subcommittee has a lengthy and bipartisan record that has recognized the importance of building safety and provided vital resources for the adoption and enforcement of current model codes. DURA enabled FEMA to help communities implement resilient codes pre-disaster and further incentivize these cost savings activities through the mitigation project scoring. Virginia secured a BRIC grant to build out a disaster response support network where code officials can quickly evaluate impacted properties to accelerate reoccupation. In July of 2022, our code officials used this training after historic flooding in Southwest Virginia. This past BRIC cycle saw FEMA create the Codes Plus Up, which recognized that BRIC's prior structure was preventing its use for code projects. Although the Codes Plus Up made progress, code investments represent less than 0.02% of BRIC spending. And this is for an activity that FEMA views as one of, if not the, most impactful community mitigation measure. ICC's top priority and recommendation is the continuation of the Plus Up program. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. And thank you all for your testimony. We will now turn to questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes of questions, and I'm going to go off my own script just based on some of your testimony today. Of course, we're talking about FEMA and codes and how they're used, and we were told with the creation of the 2018 pre-disaster mitigation program under FEMA that we were going to save taxpayers anywhere from $4 to $11 for every dollar invested. Now, that's been mentioned by folks on the dais here. Ms. Davis, you mentioned it as well. You also said that it doesn't cost taxpayers any money, and I understand that this is an organization that does it on its own. The government maybe doesn't pay for the construction of the codes, but I know when I was serving at the township level as a volunteer, we saw codes go from something that were literally this thick to now we got volumes on the table, volumes of stuff to wade through, and of course the township has to buy that. The township has to update that every single time. The township is supported by taxpayers. Taxpayers do fund this, and with all due respect to kind of everybody, I don't know where the figures $4 to $11 saved for every dollar come from. I'd love to see the math on that, other than just the claim, as well as the math on that it's actually reduced mortgage cost or flood insurance cost. Now, I lived in a home as a young child that my mother still lives in. It was flooded completely out twice. You know, that was before FEMA existed. We toughed it out and rebuilt the house and so on and so forth. But I just question all those things. And I would ask you this, see it as the proper role of the federal government to enforce these building codes on the 350 plus million Americans that live in our country. Is it the proper role of the federal government to do that? Yes, ma'am, that's to you, Ms. Davis.
So I think the proper role of the federal government is to provide mitigation efforts to keep their citizens safe.
When you say provide, so that would be, it's here if you want to use it, as opposed to you will use it or you're not going to build your home or you're not going to rebuild your home. That's essentially where I'm headed with that question.
Yeah, I don't think anybody is suggesting a mandatory requirement, but I do think that incentivizing states and governments and helping them to recognize the benefits and the cost savings that could be had by implementing mitigation measures as opposed to suffering after climatic disasters, man-made disasters, whatever disaster helps where you have to rebuild. It simply makes no sense to rebuild something over and over again.
Oh, I
to a
agree with you
lesser
completely, and
standard.
I don't think the federal government should be in that business. My mother still lives in the house by the creek. She has flood insurance. She likes to live by the creek, but there's a cost that comes with that. Every time, you know, if it floods, you got to live with that, and I don't think, and she doesn't think that that should be a cost burdened by or borne by every single American citizen who don't have access to the nice home with the view of the creek. Mr. Cranbull, I'm just curious. You know, these codes exist, and of course they get updated. Now, you're a master plumber. If a home is destroyed in Nevada due to some disaster, and FEMA comes in and says, here's the code that has to be enforced, let's say it has leaded joints on the sanitary line, and you're tearing that stuff out. Does anybody do leaded joints anymore? Do you need FEMA and the ICC to tell you to not put in leaded joints, or you're going to go get some PVC and some glue and redo that piping that way? How's that going to go? Can you turn your mic on, sir?
Chairman Perry, thank you for that question. We believe we know what's best in our state and in our communities. And our code the uniform codes are up to date on the latest technologies. So you're absolutely right. No, we're not going to put in lead joints. No, we're not going to put that back. We're going to put in the latest materials that fit best to the approved codes, that work best for.
Are you going to do that because the federal government mandates that you do that? Or are you going to do that because that's the best practice and you know it because it works?
That's the best practice for our jurisdiction and where we live in our state. We don't believe that FEMA and federal government should tell us what we should be doing as far as plumbing and HVAC codes in Nevada. We feel we know better than they do.
I would agree with you, and with the committee's indulgence, I just want to refer to this chart here. Mr. Hughes, I want to talk to you about the impact of building codes on how FEMA money is distributed. Now, this shows the distribution here, and you can see the dark blue area for the federal share. Now, look, I'm from Pennsylvania, dark blue. So Pennsylvania is getting a pile of the federal share. Some of my committee members, Louisiana, California, New York, North Carolina, but Mr. Ezell, Mississippi, not so much. Now, if I look in the criteria for building code adoption enforcement, you get 5 points additional if you have a disaster, but to attain those points, you have to be up to date on the 2018 or 2021 ICC Council Code. Another 5 points. You get 5 points over and over again if you're up to date with the ICC, but you don't get it if not. Now, look, this is great for Pennsylvania, Louisiana, California, but the other states, I don't know if they're not as good at grant writing or what the deal is, but can you speak to how you feel the money is distributed, if you do know, based on these points awarded by FEMA, which I would contend not only incentivize, but also coerce municipalities to adopt these codes?
Well, admittedly, I'm not well versed on the subject, and we can provide more information later. But there's no question that there's some diversity on how these funds are dispersed, and I guess I can address even more specifically how it affects us in North Carolina. I agree with some of the other comments that things simply are not a one-size-fits-all, and we feel like it's very unfair that these funds are distributed based on that.
Thank you, sir. And with that, I've extended my time. I yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Titus from Nevada.
Thank you. I just want to be real clear that when you all say that you don't think FEMA should impose a one-size-fits-all code and that you know what's best for Nevada, for North Carolina, you're not suggesting that you don't have any codes, are you? You're just suggesting that you have your own code, because I believe that you don't, builders don't put these in place because they know they're the best. We just heard Mr. Strickland talk about how cost was a big factor. So let's make that clear for the record. You're not saying no code, you're just saying you want the regional codes that you all decide on. Is that right?
Could I address that? We're very diverse in North Carolina with topography and geography. We have coastal areas with high winds. We have mountainous areas where we've literally had problems with new home sites sliding off the side of mountains. I live in the Piedmont area, which is easier to build to, but absolutely not. We have to have codes.
Okay,
But
all right, I just want to make that clear. And
Yeah.
Mr. Crane, Bill, the same?
Yes, ma'am. We have codes that cover our entire state, and they're tailored and amended to our needs. In the south, it focuses on hot, dry climates. In the north, snow and ice and cold. So absolutely, we want codes adopted, yes.
Okay, because it was starting to sound like, we don't want no codes, we don't like codes, don't tell us what to do, and I don't believe that's the point that you were trying to make, so let's be clear about that. In 2018, Congress passed the Bipartisan Budget Act, and it included a provision that allowed for an increased federal cost share from FEMA for states, territories, and tribes that have undertaken mitigation measures, including the adoption of the most recent hazard-resistant codes. Now, that provision was supposed to have been enacted in early 2019, but FEMA still hasn't released any policy guidance. I would ask you all how impactful you think this incentive would be to encouraging states to increase their own mitigation investments, and which investments should FEMA prioritize when implementing this law to have the greatest impact on reducing federal disaster responses. Maybe we can start with Mr. Strickland.
Thank you very much for the question, and we do support the idea of incentivizing, and we too have been looking forward to FEMA's policy on it and how it would be implemented. Incentivizing will, in our opinion, move preparedness forward and response to disaster capabilities forward with additional and improved assets and resources to do that. And from the mitigation perspective, we look strongly at transformational mitigation that will change a community's threats and vulnerabilities to natural hazards as we would approach that. And that particularly is an area that the codes are going to be very significant.
Ms. Davis?
So I think one of the most effective things that FEMA can do for state and local governments is to support action that enhances our capabilities and minimizes frequent dependence on the federal government. As a state, Virginia, for 50 years, has taken our responsibilities seriously and had a statewide building code and did that to protect our citizens. But without having any ability of having recognition for the work that we did without taking any federal money, we have no way to incentivize continuing to do that. I think it's important that FEMA recognizes and rewards, in the event of a disaster, helping to give states who do the right thing more benefit.
Mr. Cranville, you heard mention the cost codes plus up program. Has that been successful? Do you think that's a good idea? Should it be continued?
I've heard that, yes. Providing resources, we think it's a good thing, but the key issue here is providing resources for the adoption and implementation of codes. And one way that Codes Plus can be strengthened by FEMA is to recognize and treat with parity all major construction codes. To bring this to point, 17 members of Congress that sit on this committee, 9 members, most of the committee live in states where IAPMO's codes or state authorized codes are used by the industry. So the recognition of all codes would help strengthen this effort and get more people involved and want to participate, rather than if their codes aren't recognized, they're not going to participate.
Okay, just real briefly, I would mention that in some of this code changing and changing courses by FEMA, unions and contractors were on the same page on this.
Yes.
Yes. Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Ezell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. And having been through Hurricane Katrina at my home in 2005 with 4 feet of mud and water and you name it in my house, it was miserable. And I wasn't the only person in my hometown that went through this. Many others did. And we all know that good building codes make better and safer homes and places to live and to rebuild in a better way. But what I can tell you is, after the storm, and that, you know, in South Mississippi, we say storm. Before Katrina, it was Camille. When you said the storm, we knew we were talking about Hurricane Camille. Now we're talking about Katrina. And what I'd like to say is, just yesterday, I'm on the phone with FEMA administration, still trying to get funding for the city of Biloxi. And this is back in 2005. And we've had a great deal of frustration trying to get these things done because of various issues that continue to come up. So what I'd like to say is that we've got to get this together. We've got to get this straightened out. And one size don't fit all. One community is not the same as the other. And, you know, I want to work with you and I want to try to get some things done. But we've got to get, we got to do a better job at what's going on with this FEMA and the way that they operate. You know, one size does not fit all, and we can do better. Ms. Davis, different building codes and standards cover different systems. How are these codes and standards coordinated so that there aren't conflicts or confusion in the implementation?
So the I-codes overall are a highly coordinated set of codes. They work together so that, particularly when you're talking about resiliency and mitigation efforts, you're looking at a building as a whole, from foundation to final. You're not looking at just a piece of pipe or a mechanical system. They have to work together and they have to reference other parts of the code. You have to be looking at means of egress. You have to be looking at fire combustion. You have to be looking at ventilation requirements. ICC's codes, as an example, I believe the IPC and IMC references over 500 times requirements in their other codes that have to be complied with. So it's critically important that all of the codes for the entire building, from the foundation to the final, from the building envelope and everything inside, be coordinated so that it all works together. If you have conflicting codes, it can cause, at a minimum, confusion, and at the worst, problems.
Thank you. Mr. Crayenbull, do you think it's appropriate for a governing body who sets the codes and standards to also have a business interest in the codes they produce? And doesn't this risk some conflict of interest?
Chairman Perry, to you, I think it can be an issue if there's businesses or private industry, but everyone's involved in the code process, whether it be jurisdictional, whether it be contractors, labor, engineering, whatever. So can it be a conflict of interest? Maybe, but I think that one size fits all does not work, and the point is what different states do in different regions, like Louisiana, where the levee protected areas, they have reasons that they do things for a reason. We do things in Nevada for a reason. And so I guess that would be my response.
Thank you. Mr. Strickland, I'd like for you to expand just a little bit on your support for H.R. 7671, which I was a proud original co-sponsor. We just passed this morning. Can you talk about that just a little bit and how it's going to affect things going forward?
What it will end up doing is allow eligible expenses that came from that disaster to be used beyond the time of the closeout of the disaster. which then will allow the state and the local jurisdiction to build capacity as well as projects within that particular arena forward. It basically it's a plus to the community to, again, be able to build capacity and build, do additional transformational mitigation and options like that.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to go on the record to say that in South Mississippi, we are still dealing with trying to get some recovery done since Hurricane Katrina, and that's just really not acceptable. Thank you for that. I yield back.
Did he yield? Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. North.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last Congress, Democrats passed several major laws to combat climate change and to mitigate the impacts of climate change. However, Congress must do much more to combat and prepare for climate change. Mr. Strickland, what are the most important things Congress can do to help communities strengthen their climate resilience?
There are probably several different areas, but I think one of them is the ability for the local jurisdiction to identify and understand what the climate change is going to do, what additional threats and hazards it builds for that area, creates for that area, and then allow them through their planning, training, and exercise perspective to better prepare for it and be aware of it. Congress could assist us greatly, just as they have with the management cost, and allow us to be able to utilize that money into the future. One of the greatest challenges at the local jurisdiction is there is not the capacity to do that type of planning, training, and exercise as we move forward. And that's even before we get into the conversation about doing transformational mitigation in an area which could improve it so that the climate change can be eradicated, basically, or served better than it would have originally been.
Thank you. Disadvantaged communities often bear the brunt of climate change and take the longest to recover from disasters. Ms. Davis, how could the Building Resilience Infrastructure and Communities Building Codes Plus Up program help disadvantaged communities mitigate the impacts of and recover quicker from climate disasters?
So the ability of communities to recover and to prevent disasters in the first place rests primarily in the communities. If those communities do not have the resources to adopt and enforce important building codes that keep people safe and allow them to recover after a disaster, they will obviously not have the same protection as communities that do have that.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Chairman thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Representative Grace.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. Number one, I want to start out saying that over the past several years, I think the committee has made a lot of progress in sort of pivoting or making a paradigm shift in that the federal government used to just throw billions and billions of dollars in the aftermath of a disaster and didn't pay appropriate attention, in my opinion, on the front end of what we can do to actually avert disaster. The chair has been tireless in his efforts to try and save the federal government money, but study after study have shown, as Mr. Strickland's organization knows, that you can spend, $1 on the front end, and depending on which study you want to choose, you can get anywhere from $2.50 of savings to, I've seen studies showing $14, $17 in savings. And whatever the number is, there's no question that the right principled investments on the front end result in cost savings on the back end. And coming from a disaster-prone state, the bigger thing is that we're not picking up the pieces in our community. We're not watching devastated families, businesses, homes, which that's priceless. But you know, the DARA reforms that we did, and I got to give a shout out to some people on our team, Paul Sawyer and Jennifer Bollinger and Loganza and Peggy Airy and others that were big help in getting some of these things done. We've made a lot of progress, but looking at what the federal government's doing today with their new CISA, which climate informed, Climate informed, dang it, I don't remember now. Science approach, climate-informed science approach, which is basically looking at what elevation standard you're supposed to be using. I want to make note that there's a federal agency called CISA, and maybe they could have chosen a better acronym, but we'll put that on the shelf for a minute. But you have a scenario now to where CISA, I think, is supposed to be the uniform standard, but you don't have appropriate data for the country to know, for it to apply all the way across the country. And so what may happen in a situation is that the CISA data may say, all right, well, you need to do BFE plus 1. And that's what the CISA data says is supposed to be the most accurate data. But then the law says that you got to do BFE plus 2. So then you're back up to a plus 2. Two different standards right there. Then you have a third standard that the Corps of Engineers uses in some cases. So effectively, you don't have a uniform standard. And what happens, and we had a markup in here earlier talking a lot about the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. You may have somebody who gets funds and they're going to rebuild their home and they think they're complying with this standard whenever they go and apply, but then later on you may have a different standard in place. You have a 3-year uniform code adoption period, but CISA data may come in and evolve on a monthly basis or every 6 months or every year. Bottom line is you don't have a uniform standard, and all you're doing is causing greater uncertainty for the folks that are out there in the community trying to rebuild. Mr. Strickland, do you have any thoughts or reaction to this and how we truly provide certainty and how we make a science-informed decision and communicate that to communities?
That's a really tough question.
But is having disparate standards appropriate?
Well, and I don't know that they're quote-unquote disparate standards. I think it's important that each state and the communities accept the standard and the most recent edition of that standard and put their efforts into that. I think it's going to take us time, of which none of us will be here when that data will be present for us to review. And as codes and standards change and improve and the technology improves, then I think the quality of life as we apply all of that will improve. But it's not necessarily going to be a light switch kind of operation. We have one community in our state, Frederick, if any of you have had the opportunity to visit downtown Frederick, severe flooding with Agnes in 1972. It went through almost a 20-year project to channel the water and move it to where it would be safe, not flood businesses, not kill lives. And it wasn't until 3 summers ago that that system proved it was worth every dime of it. So we can only predict so much.
Quick another question for you, and I want to follow up and question on the record on that one, but quick another question. So we were involved in creating the BRIC program, big proponent, but we've watched it that's been incredibly oversubscribed. Watching as FEMA's coming in and awarding funds for code adoption versus actual mitigation projects, do you think that's an appropriate approach and utilization of funds?
I think there has to be a balance with that because there are areas that are severely lacking with codes. I mean, there has to be some standard for them to work toward.
Mr. Hughes, I've got questions on building codes for you, and I apologize I'm out of time, but I'll follow up questions in writing. But thanks again. Appreciate y'all being here.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady, Ms. Napolitano, Representative Napolitano, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Davis, please discuss any difficulties jurisdictions have or may face using Stafford Act assistance for building code adoption and enforcement activities within the first 180 days of a major disaster. How, if any at all, would you modify authority providing this assistance to ensure they are utilized effectively?
I couldn't tell. Can you get a little closer to the mic, ma'am? I don't think we can tell what you.
Thank you. How, if at all, would you modify authorities providing this assistance to ensure they're utilized effectively? juris, any difficulty jurisdictions may have using Stafford Act assistance for building code adoption and enforcement activities within the first 180 days of a major disaster. How, if at all, would you modify authorities providing this assistance to ensure they're utilized effectively?
And that's from Ms. Davis, ma'am? That question?
So I think if I understood the question right, it is that should there be a requirement for adoption and enforcement of a building code after 6 months of a disaster in order to get FEMA dollars? Is that correct? Yes. I think you should not be building back to a lesser standard using federal taxpayer dollars. I think it's important in the recovery efforts to build back to current codes. And if I could just
Elaborate.
expand on that a little bit to clarify, I think everybody here has said, and I want to make it very clear that ICC and myself included for the state of Virginia has always encouraged amendments that references local needs. It's very clearly not a one-size-fits-all. It's every community, every state, every jurisdiction has to do what is in their own best interests. And ICC has long recognized the need to amend the codes. The model codes is a beginning point, not an end. And as long as the amendments don't affect the structural integrity and resiliency and looks only at affordability and some of the other things, I think it's perfectly fine.
Thank you. Mr. Strickland, what authorities and resources would be needed in order for FEMA or other federal agencies to provide funding, education, and support needed to increase building code compliance by individuals and households following a disaster, as well as before disaster occurs?
Did you understand, Mr. Strickland?
I got part of it.
Ms. Titus is going to.
I think what the Congresswoman is asking is what kind of resources are needed to educate the public about what it can do to avoid a disaster situation or prepare for it.
And I think that's part of the effort that FEMA is attempting, is that across the board and from a whole community perspective, that we do educate everyone involved with it. From a personal perspective, and I think many of my colleagues would say, this is an educational process that needs to start just like Stop, Drop, and Roll does in the school systems when you're on fire kind of thing. This is a change in a cultural improvement that has got to be made, that we carry this through our society for the future. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight, and it needs to start sooner than later from an educational perspective.
Thank you. I know that I believe you're right. One size does not fit all. And I'm certain that some of the states that don't have regulations are probably wishing they did if they have disaster hitting them. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Chair, thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes Representative Huffman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Titus, for holding today's hearing. It's an important discussion about how we can encourage more communities to adopt and implement hazard-resistant building codes that will increase resilience, save lives, and lower costs in the face of a growing climate crisis. We need to consider cost-effective ways to help communities adapt to, mitigate, and recover from natural disasters. I also want to address the urgent need to update our building codes to prevent a disaster of a different kind. A little-known building safety flaw that has killed thousands of people around the country, including a child in my district. In 2019, 7-year-old Alex Quanbeck was tragically killed by a poorly designed, ill-maintained gate while he was playing with friends during recess. I'm talking about the heavy iron gates that slide open and closed, usually on rollers. Alex was tossing a football when he attempted to stop the ball from rolling away by closing the schoolyard gate. However, as he pushed the gate closed, it detached from its supporting hardware and collapsed on him. Alex was crushed by 300 pounds of metal in a shocking accident which could have been prevented had the gate been equipped with a simple safety feature that costs no more than $50. Unfortunately, Alex is one of many children and adults who have been killed or injured by a faulty gate while at school, work, home, or other settings. To address these issues, I've been working closely with concerned parents, consumer advocates, and industry stakeholders to update building codes and product safety standards. I plan to introduce legislation to direct the Consumer Product Safety Commission to promulgate a mandatory rule and to run an awareness campaign to ensure new gates are equipped with an inexpensive safety feature. I also support the ongoing effort to incorporate new gate safety standards into building codes, including a proposal from the Hummingbird Alliance, American Fence Association, and others to update the ICC's model building codes. So, Ms. Davis, I wonder if I could ask you to please speak to the importance of gate safety.
Thank you for that question. And I recognize the tragedy of that event, and it's heartbreaking. I know that our staff has been engaged with this and that they have met and discussed this. I believe that ICC is working with the American Fence Association, and they are working closely on this matter, along with Alex's father, toward a code change proposal next year. I think they met last week with the Building Code Action Committee, and the idea seemed to receive high levels of support from key members of the Building Code Action Committee, or BCAC as we know them. So, you know, as such, I believe that this will be an important issue to be discussed moving forward in the code. Mm-hmm.
I do appreciate that. I wonder if you could speak to the specific steps that the ICC is taking to ensure that modern gate safety standards are incorporated in the next edition of the codes, and whether you would support an updated gate safety standard. I also am interested in knowing about any challenges that the ICC may face in incorporating new safety standards, such as mandatory gate safety standards, into model building codes.
I would be in support of that. And off the top of my head, I cannot think of any negative reason why it wouldn't receive, I can't think of any argument that anyone would have against implementing a standard like that.
Any
I believe
thoughts?
it's an ASTM standard on the gate safety that could be implemented into the code requirement process.
Yeah, thank you. Any thoughts on how Congress can support these efforts?
We can provide information as to the code process, and if you are interested in writing a letter of support or providing testimony during the code update process, certainly we would welcome that. We'd also be happy to make introductions to the California Building Officials Association, CalBO. If you're not familiar with them, I think they would be a huge help in shepherding this forward.
All right. I really want to thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to have this exchange. I know it's a little bit outside of the main topic of conversation, but it's a very important issue and a simple fix, and I appreciate those who are already coming together to hopefully find a solution and save some lives. And with that, I yield back.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. The gentleman does yield back. Are there further questions from any members of the subcommittee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that does conclude our hearing for today. I would like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony, your time, travel here. This subcommittee now stands adjourned.